All right, so this is the last presentation for Unit 1. In this one, we're looking at the New Kingdom of Egypt and Nubia, at least for the first section. All right, so the New Kingdom, this started after the Hyksos. They invaded Egypt, ended the Middle Kingdom. And then after this, you see the New Kingdom begin with Queen Ahotep. She takes over, draws out the Hyksos, and the New Kingdom begins. And so this is the last period, really, of the Egyptian Empire before they begin to falter, and then eventually the Greeks take over, and then the Romans after that. So at this point, pharaohs, they're very warlike. They're expanding for the most part. And then you get Queen Hatshepsut. She takes over and decides that she wants to focus more on trade and bringing peace, basically, to the kingdom. So she stops warfare for a while until her stepson, Thutmose III, killed her. And so he kills her, takes over as pharaoh, and then goes back to fighting again. So he takes over Syria, Palestine, Nubia, and greatly expands the empire quite a bit. So now Egypt controls like the Middle East, the Sinai Peninsula, and of course where Egypt is today. Then they basically get a hold of gold, cattle, and ivory were the main things they traded. And then of course slaves from Nubia, which is to the south of Egypt. And then they face the Hittites. This is the first time the Egyptians face someone they can't defeat. The Hittites had iron weapons, and they were able to at least bring them to a peace treaty. So they signed a peace treaty. It brings peace for about 100 years between the two groups, but eventually the Hittites are going to come back and defeat them. So you see the empire decline. They start getting attacked by other unknown groups, and then the Philistines, and then most likely the Hittites and some other people, because obviously expanding like that, they're going to create a lot of enemies throughout the area. And then Libyans and Nubians also take over Egypt at different times and begin to weaken the overall empire. And then the Cushites move in, so Egypt pretty much falls altogether. And then the Nubians, they're down to the south along the Nile, south of the first cataract, which is, like rapids and stuff in the Nile. And then the Cushites, they wanted to preserve Egyptian culture as much as they could. So they conquered Libyans and Egypt, and they put Pianki in charge. And so they basically continued Egyptian culture for the most part going on after that. But then not too soon after that, the Assyrians come in and take over. And then you have the Persians and the Babylonians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, and so on and so forth. All right, and then you get to Assyria. So Assyria is the next big empire coming out of the Middle East. So they were started in Mesopotamia, which we talked about as one of the river valley civilizations. So between Tigris and Euphrates River, present-day Iraq. These people are very warlike because of the flat plains. They don't have any natural barriers. We talked about how these cities had to build walls to protect them. But also these people had to learn how to fight, and so they were very intense. So under King Sennacherib, they sacked 89 cities, so totally decimated, destroyed 89 major cities, 820 villages, burned Babylon down to the ground, and they killed almost everyone they came across. So they just annihilated everyone. So think of them as like the ISIS of the ancient world. And they were heavily organized. They had iron weapons and huge shields. They were amazing at building bridges, so they can move their army very quickly across rivers and different types of terrain. And then when they would come up to a walled city, they would dig tunnels down to get underneath the walls, or at least the foundation of the wall, and they would start breaking down the walls from underneath. And then archers, of course, would shoot while the battering ram was going in and attacking the city. And then they would get in and kill pretty much everyone, chopping all their heads off. And then each soldier would get it. His bounty was based on how many heads he chopped off, so they basically have piles. And that's how they divvied up the bounty. So obviously very, very warlike. All right, so Assyria, they defeat Syria, Palestine, Babylon, and Egypt, take over that whole region you see there in that picture. And then they divided up their kingdom into provinces with rulers over each province. They reported, of course, back to the king. If people didn't pay taxes, if they refused, they would destroy the cities, burn it to the ground, and either exile the people or kill all of them. But of course, this is going to be like really the end of their civilization. It's because of how brutal they are. People will revolt. So as far as their culture goes, their greatest city was Nineveh. It was home to an amazing library, had 25,000 clay tablets, all stuff from the ancient world. Nineveh was eventually destroyed and burned to the ground, but it actually preserved the clay tablets. So in the end, it was a good thing, at least for history. And then, so Nineveh is destroyed 612 BC, and by the Medes and Chaldeans, they take over after that. And you can see here the Jews celebrating. the destruction of Assyria, because they had also conquered the Jews, and they didn't put them in exile, but at least had to pay heavy taxes and treated them horribly. So in the book of Nahum, the Jews are celebrating the destruction of Nineveh. All right, and then you get to Babylon. So Babylon's restored, and King Nebuchadnezzar takes over and expands the Babylonian Empire. He also built one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens. It's not there anymore. But basically, it's this big garden system he created right in the middle of the desert, and he brought in trees and plants from all different parts of the empire all together there. And he built it for his wife, who loved all the greenery. Like, really didn't like the desert. She wasn't originally from the desert area, and so she didn't like how just bland and crappy it looks. So he built that for her. And then, of course, Babylon also takes over the Jews and puts them into slavery for 70 years.